Until the 1980s, no man in the entire history of the world could ever be completely certain he was a biological father. Not kings, not emperors, not the wealthiest, most powerful men who ever lived, with armies and priests and entire legal systems built around passing their bloodline down to the next generation. For the whole of human history, up until a shockingly recent moment, that single fact, "Is this my child?" was permanently, unavoidably unknowable. A mother has never had that problem. Pregnancy and birth make maternity impossible to fake or doubt. But fatherhood has always required trust, guesswork, or an elaborate social system built to manage a question biology simply refused to answer. So how did ancient humans handle one of the most consequential uncertainties a person could face? Let's start with why this mattered so much in the first place. In a world with no safety net, no state support, no fallback beyond your own family and community, a father's willingness to invest time, food, protection, and resources into a child could be the difference between that child surviving or not. But investing all of that into a child who might not actually carry your bloodline was, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, a costly mistake. So across nearly every ancient society, enormous energy went into managing this single unanswerable question, not through science, because there was none, but through social engineering. The most common approach, found across a huge range of ancient and historical cultures, was to try to control the uncertainty at the source. Strict expectations around marital fidelity, social and legal consequences for infidelity, often severe, and often applied unevenly. Practices of seclusion, chaperonage, and closely monitored courtship, especially around newly married women. None of this actually solved the biological problem, but it reduced the odds enough in the eyes of these societies to make inheritance, land, titles, and family identity feel safe enough to pass down the paternal line. But not every culture solved the problem the same way. Some sidestepped it almost entirely. In a number of documented societies, family lineage, inheritance, and identity were organized not through the father's line at all, but through the mother's. In these matrilineal systems, a child's place in the family, their claim to property, their social identity, passed down through their mother and her relatives, uncles and grandmothers on the maternal side, rather than the father. It's a remarkably elegant solution to an unsolvable problem. If paternity can never be verified, simply stop building your entire social structure around requiring it to be. Several indigenous nations in North America organized society this way historically, and matrilineal systems have been documented on nearly every continent throughout history. And then there's a solution stranger than either of those, one that still exists today in parts of the Amazon. In several documented indigenous societies in South America, cultures held a belief researchers call partible paternity, the idea that a single child could have more than one biological father. If a woman had relationships with multiple men during pregnancy, each of those men could be considered a contributing father to the child, all at once. Not in sequence, not as a mistake to be resolved, but as an accepted, understood family structure. In practice, this meant multiple men might share responsibility for feeding, protecting, and raising that one child. Researchers who've studied these communities have found that children recognized as having multiple fathers sometimes had measurably better survival odds than children with only one, because more than one man felt genuinely invested in keeping them alive. It's a strategy so different from anything in Western family history that it's almost hard to process at first. But it solved the exact same underlying problem every other culture was wrestling with, just from a completely different angle. Instead of trying to guarantee certainty, spread the investment wide enough that certainty stopped being the point. Even in cultures that stuck with the traditional single-father model, there was a subtler trick almost everyone seemed to use, whether they realized it or not: resemblance. Family members, across an enormous range of cultures, have a well-documented tendency to comment specifically on how much a new baby looks like its father, often more than how much it looks like its mother, even when, objectively, resemblance to both parents tends to be roughly similar in early infancy. Researchers studying this pattern believe it isn't random. Pointing out paternal resemblance, even exaggerating it a little, may have functioned as a quiet social nudge, reassuring an uncertain father and everyone else around him that this child was in fact his, nudging him toward exactly the kind of investment a child actually needed to survive. Nobody was running a study, nobody understood evolutionary psychology. But the instinct to reassure through resemblance shows up again and again, almost like a piece of ancient social technology nobody consciously designed. For every one of these solutions, the underlying truth never changed. Nobody actually knew. Entire legal systems, entire religious frameworks around marriage, entire inheritance structures moving wealth and land and power from one generation to the next, were all built on top of a question that remained scientifically unanswerable for the entire span of human civilization. And then, in a genuinely startling instant on the timeline of our species, that changed completely. In 1984, a geneticist working in England discovered that DNA contained patterns unique enough to identify individuals and their biological relatives with near total certainty. Within just a few years, DNA paternity testing moved from a scientific curiosity into something an ordinary person could actually request. For the first time in the entire history of Homo sapiens, a father could simply know, not guess, not trust, not build an elaborate social system to manage the uncertainty. No, with almost complete confidence, in a matter of weeks. Think about how enormous that shift actually is. Every dynasty, every inheritance dispute, every family structure, every cultural rule around marriage and fidelity across the entire span of recorded history existed inside a permanent fog that simply never lifted, until a laboratory discovery less than 50 years ago quietly ended it forever. We tend to think of DNA testing as a minor modern convenience, something for talk shows and legal disputes. But it resolved a question that shaped law, religion, inheritance, and family structure for the entire duration of human civilization. For every single generation before ours, who is your father wasn't just a private, personal question. It was one of the most consequential, unanswerable uncertainties a person could carry. And an astonishing amount of ancient human culture, from marriage law to seclusion customs to shared fatherhood in the Amazon, was quietly built around trying to live with an answer nobody could actually have. If you want more of the history nobody actually teaches you, subscribe. Because next week's video is about a question just as old as this one, and just as unsettled.